The grandfather clock in the central hall of Blackwood Manor had always possessed an unnerving stillness. Not in its appearance, it was a towering sentinel of polished mahogany and tarnished brass, but in the absolute refusal of its intricate workings to acknowledge the passage of time. For 50 years, its pendulum had been frozen mid-swing, a silent, immobile promise of history deferred. It was this unnerving silence, heavy and suffocating in the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaded windows, that Elias Atherton found himself scrutinizing, running a fingertip over the elaborate carving of a coiled serpent that wound around the base. It wasn't the silence of neglect, but the silence of deliberate preservation, and it was the first true indicator that the edifice of their family history might be built on foundations of quicksand. His sister, Clara, leaned against the heavy oak banister, arms crossed tightly over a worn black sweater. Grief still clung to them both, a palpable shroud following the recent death of their mother, Eleanor. They had returned to Blackwood to settle the estate, a task that felt less like accounting and more like archaeology. Everything Eleanor had touched felt weighted with unspoken history, but the clock, known universally among the few remaining Athertons as the Watcher, held a disproportionate amount of their mother's last frantic anxiety. Elias recalled her final weeks, her gaze constantly drifting toward the clock, a flicker of panic in her eyes whenever anyone approached it. Now, faced with the necessity of inventory, the Watcher stood not as an heirloom, but as an impossible obstruction. "She practically taped a do not touch sign to this thing with her last breath, Elias," Clara muttered, her voice echoing faintly in the cavernous space. "It's not in the will, not mentioned anywhere in the inventory ledger. It's just here, immovable and useless." Elias, the meticulous archivist of the family, nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the fine seam where the upper cabinet met the clock face. The sheer craftsmanship suggested an origin centuries older than the rest of the manor's furnishings, perhaps late 17th century. Yet beneath the patina of age, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible discoloration, a fine line that ran horizontally across the grain just below the Roman numeral VI. It was a demarcation line, not of age, but of manipulation. "It's not useless, Clara. It's the linchpin," Elias corrected, his historian's instinct sharpening into a sudden, cold certainty. "Everything in this house has a document, a provenance, a story we know, except this. And you remember Mother's insistence that it was always to remain in the hall, untouched, unrepaired." The tension began to coil tightly in the air, transforming the inherited melancholy into nascent fear.
They were not dealing with a simple family secret, like an old affair or a lost cache of jewels. This felt older, colder, tied perhaps to the very founding myths of the Atherton line, which claimed descent from philosophers and early scientific pioneers. This clock, Elias suddenly felt certain, was the lock to a door they were never meant to open. He pulled a small, silver-handled screwdriver from his toolkit, its presence jarring in the quiet, dusty grandeur. Beneath the main drive weight, secured by a thin length of oxidized iron wire, was a small, perfectly square recess that held a heavy, dense object, almost like a counterweight itself, but far too small to serve that function. Clara moved closer, peering over his shoulder, the smell of old clock oil and dust filling the space between them. "What is that? A spare part?" "No," Elias breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Look at the texture. It's not brass. It looks like magnetite, or maybe hematite, and it's humming." It wasn't an audible sound, but a vibration that seemed to travel directly through the metal shell of the clock and into his bones, a low, insistent thrum that spoke of contained energy. He tried to dislodge it, but the wire was taut, almost fused into the wood. The recess was too deep, the space too confined for tools. He needed access from the front. Working feverishly now, Elias carefully unscrewed the faceplate. This was their ancestor's mechanism, a legacy puzzle waiting exactly 150 years for a descendant desperate or foolish enough to tamper with it. As the heavy brass dial was lifted away, revealing the naked gears beneath, a faint, almost invisible script became visible,
etched onto the interior surface of the wood backboard, just above where the hands connected. It was a cipher, certainly, but one utilizing symbols that Elias recognizes studies of Renaissance alchemical texts, 3 overlapping circles and a starburst symbol. "It's a sequence," Clara whispered, her face pale. "It's not meant to be read, but executed, like a combination lock." Elias's hands trembled. He realized they weren't searching for a hidden key. The clock was the key. He looked at the external faceplate again, focusing on the hours. He quickly correlated the alchemical symbols with specific Roman numerals based on their positions on a known Atherton family crest. The sequence demanded 3 specific numerical positions be aligned. But how? The hands were frozen. Then he noticed a tiny, almost invisible lever tucked away on the lower right corner of the mechanism, usually reserved for regulating the strike. It was stiff, protesting years of disuse. Elias gripped it firmly and gave it a gentle, deliberate push. Clack. The sound was shockingly loud in the profound silence of the hall. The humming magnetic stopped instantly. Before either of them could react, the entire front lower section of the mahogany cabinet, the part that housed the pendulum, didn't swing open, but slid inwards, retracting silently into the base like a drawer being smoothly closed. It revealed a deep, vertical cavity, lined with dark, dry velvet. The scent that rushed out was not of dust, but of ozone and stale metallic air. The cavity was not filled with jewels or money. It contained only a single object, a tightly rolled cylinder of vellum, tied with a simple, desiccated strip of rawhide. It felt ancient, fragile, and immensely heavy with import. Elias carefully lifted it out, the weight of the Atherton past suddenly settling cold and solid in his hands. He laid the scroll flat on the hall table, the silence now deafening. As Clara cautiously helped him unroll the brittle material, the script revealed itself. It was written in flawless, though antiquated English, but the ink was not carbon. It had a strange, iridescent sheen. The first line was a stark, almost accusatory declaration, signed by their earliest known ancestor, Alistair Atherton. "I confess this betrayal, knowing the cost it shall extract upon my line. The Chronos Shard is now secured. The oath of Viridia is broken. May the true stewards forgive this necessary sacrilege, for the alternative was the end of all measured time." Elias felt the floor drop out from beneath him. This was not a diary entry or a land deed. This was an admission of grand, sweeping treachery concerning an artifact with cosmic implications, the Chronos Shard. Their celebrated ancestor, the respected philosopher and historian, was a grave robber and a betrayer of some ancient, powerful order, and the magnificent, silent clock was not a guardian, but a highly sophisticated, century-spanning holding cell for a damning confession. "A necessary sacrilege," Clara repeated, her voice thin with horror. "Elias, what did he steal? What are the true stewards?" Before Elias could formulate a coherent thought, he saw the final line of the text, scribbled in a different hand, smaller and more frantic, possibly Eleanor's. It was a recent edition, underlined 3 times. "The clock has stalled. They know it is gone. Flee to the coordinates immediately. Do not trust the silence." The silence of Blackwood Manor, which had always been comforting and familiar, suddenly became predatory. The revelation was total, shattering their comfortable, known existence and replacing it with an immediate, terrifying reality. They were not merely heirs to a house, but custodians of an ancient crime, and the people, or things, who wanted the shard back were now aware that the lock had been breached. Their entire world, the lineage they treasured, the quiet life they expected, had been exposed as a brilliant, dangerous facade, and the family's legacy of honor was nothing but a calculated life-or-death diversion. Elias instinctively grabbed Clara's arm, his eyes wide and fixed on the front door. The comfort of the manor was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of global, ancient responsibility. "We don't have time for grief or questions," Elias stated, his voice now crisp and decisive, cutting through the fear. "If Mother's note is true, we have maybe an hour. We are going to find a map. We are going to find those coordinates. And then, Clara, we run."